Welcome to part 2 of the academic style. We're also talking about neoclassical art and romantic art. Now, all of this art led up to a great rebellion that was called Impressionism. But that's coming up. We're not there yet. Now, out of the neoclassical style came a style of painting called Romanticism. And it took the classical themes and it added drama. These are both really interesting themes here because they kind of reflect a radicalism that was beginning to come forth at the time. Like, we're not in just sweet little morality tales anymore. One of them is exemplified by the work of John Henry Fuseli. And if you look at the one on the bottom, the picture on the bottom, it's called The Nightmare. This is a Swiss artist, and he grew up and eventually settled in England. And he was a Shakespeare translator. Now, by the 1780s, he had begun to make his reputation as a romantic painter. But this work pictures what they call the incubus. And this is so great. This is the creature who sits on the chests of virgins while they are asleep and gives them distressing, erotic dreams. Now, this is one of 4 versions of this theme that this guy painted. And when it was exhibited, it created quite a scandal. However, print versions of these 4 paintings sold very, very well. And in fact, later, Sigmund Freud, who founded psychoanalysis, had this print on his office wall his entire working life. So, part of psychoanalysis is an exploration of the unconscious and of dreams, and apparently this meant something to him. Now, the other image at the top is by William Blake, and he was a famous author and a philosopher of the day. And this is a watercolor that he did. He did a little bit of a stint at the Academy, but he just left that feeling that all the rules hindered his art rather than added to creativity. And I think I kind of agree. I always say you learn the rules so you can break them when you know why. Now, William Blake became a lifelong advocate of explorations involving imagination, and he believed that this offered access to the higher realms of the spirit. This painting is of Sir Isaac Newton, and again, it's a watercolor, which is very radical for its time. Here's someone who I really like to talk about. This is Francisco Goya. And he was in Madrid in the late 1700s and became the principal painter to the king. Now, he was part of this group of intellectuals that agreed with the ideals that led to the French Revolution. Now, at first, the king who he worked for, which was Charles III, he supported these ideas, and he reformed the laws of Spain to allow for more freedoms for the Spanish people. He ended the cruel Spanish Inquisition, and he reduced the church's power. But after he saw what was happening in France with the excesses of the revolutionaries and all those heads whacked off by the guillotines, he got a little scared, and he reinstituted the policies. Now, Goya responded with a series of 80 etchings. The cover piece for the series is seen on the right, and it's called The Sleep of Reason Produces Monsters. Now think about this. He did 80 etchings, which means he etched 80 plates, and he printed 300 sets of 80 images each. He offered them for sale in 1799 for exactly 2 days, and he took them off the market with no explanation. Historians believe that he was warned by the church to remove the etchings, or he would be asked to appear before the Inquisition, and that would mean risking torture and death. The one on the left is called Ways to Fly. I find Goya a fascinating artist, and if you want to look up his work, the difference between his court work and his work like this is phenomenal. Now, landscape painting in the Romantic era tended towards a natural approach. And here we have Frederick Church, this guy that did the 2 on the left. He's pretty famous. He worked in America in the early part of the 1800s. Now, in the painting by the same artist above, we see, the one above right, we see this more abstract approach. And this is what he did as a response to the American Civil War. It's really beautiful when you look at the upper right piece and think about it. because it was such a bloody war. And this really exemplifies that. Now the one on the right, lower right, is John Constable, which is an idealized romantic landscape. Now here's another really cool guy, Joseph Turner. He was very controversial in his day, but now if you especially look at the upper one on the left, he was an early modern painter. So he believed that experiencing being in a storm on the ocean would actually make his art better. So he'd go out during just a howling storm on a ship, and he would rope himself to the deck and go through the storm like that, and then he would come back and paint. So that's pretty much of an art happening, wouldn't you say? On the bottom we have the old slave ship coming in, and it's a crippled old ship coming in, and that could be a statement, you know, end of slavery, end of the era for this great ship. This is George Catlin, and on the left, and there is some work of his at the museum in Bentonville. But let's talk first about Thomas Cole. And his work is on the right. He's kind of known as the father of American landscape painting. He walked the Northeast wilderness and just painted what he saw. But what this did was it introduced the beautiful landscape of the Americas to people who would not otherwise see it. Now George Catlin is got a great story. So he's a lawyer, and he came to art after a career as a lawyer. He went to a speech by a visiting delegation of Native American chiefs, and he was so moved that he quit his law career and he moved to St. Louis, and he dedicated the next 6 years of his life to traveling with and painting the Native Americans. Now, what was interesting is that his work was actually really rejected. Americans were not ready to look at dignified images of Indians, but it was very popular in Europe. He was very disillusioned, so he actually moved to Europe, and eventually he had to trade his art for a bill at an art supply store. So he gave his paintings to this art supply dealer to just cover a bill. But eventually many of them did make their way to the Smithsonian, and they're seen as masterworks today. In America, most of the portrait painting was pretty primitive, and you can see a lot of this at Crystal Bridges. They weren't that good because they weren't all that trained. But this is one exception, was John Singleton Copley. He showed a gift for art at a very young age. Now, one of the things that happened in America that's very different than European portraits was these were some sturdy individuals, you know. They didn't want to be seen as aristocratic because that was kind of a bad thing. These were people who were, you know, in their own way going back to the land. So even the portraits of wealthy people were shown, like the woman is there with the fruit, and the woman on the right is seen sewing, which in Europe would be a domestic chore, and a woman of noble birth would never do that. Well, here they're proud of doing that, and that's a big difference. Now, at the beginning of the Revolutionary War, he did relocate to London, where he lived the rest of his life. So perhaps his sympathies were not in the best era. You know, he needed to get out of this country before the revolution. Eugene Delacroix, he is a really wonderful romantic painter. And as you look at his work, you can see the brushwork beginning to loosen, especially compared to like Bouguereau, who we saw at the beginning. Here, you can really see that he's actually painting this with a paintbrush. Now, when he was 34 years old, he accompanied a diplomatic mission to Morocco, and he was so moved by the people and the environment that he painted a series of works that are like the two that we see here. And there's some beautiful films and information on his notes from Morocco. They're very moving. Here's the Woman of Algiers, which is actually a huge painting and is pretty small on the upper left. It's his best known work from his travels to Morocco. I invite you to look it up and look at a larger version because his way of executing it, the painting of light and dark, is really masterful. On the right, we have the scene of a terrible massacre that was on the island of Chios, where the Greeks had attempted to gain some independence from Turkey. And the Turks ended up killing 20,000 of the 100,000 inhabitants, and the rest were taken into slavery and sold. So this was sort of his own way of doing political art and protest. Now let's look at Ingres. He was a true master of color, value, and drawing. And he's best known for his sort of sultry nudes, but as most artists, he had to make a living. So he did a lot of portraits. What I like about the one on the right is if you look carefully, you can see his initial drawing above right. And then you can see how he's continued to work it out. This is actually a woman who went on to, she was a romantic author of the day. Now this other drawing is of the classical composer Paganini, and he's a very famous composer, and obviously Ingres was able to paint him. So let's move on and see what's next. Okay, back to Bouguereau. He was one of the richest and most powerful paintings of his day. He painted many scenes that idealized antiquity, but I want to talk about the moral aspect here. Look on the right. This is a single mother, and man, her life is rough. She's made some pretty poor choices, and he did a lot of depicting that kind of imagery. So she does not have a broken jug, but in some of his images she would. So the thing to, as I said earlier, the thing to look at with Bouguereau is once it is this perfect technically, how do you improve? Well, my saying would be you loosen up. So let's look at the beginning of the loosening up. This is The Gleaners by Millet, and this is this new style of realism that's starting to back away from the idealized form. This is a very powerful painting. What these women are doing is following the hay wagons and just getting a little scrap here and there of whatever wheat is left. And if you look carefully, you see the hay wagons in the distance, and it's a sunny day, so it's very hot. And they're just trying to feed their families by picking up the scraps left behind. Another painting along the same lines is called The Third Class Carriage by Daumier, and that's in the upper right. Now let's look at a couple of more images here. Courbet, Gustave Courbet. He started painting in this classical academic style. But then he was part of a social uprising in Paris in 1848 and dedicated himself to showing the struggles of the poor through his art. This that we see here is a detail of a large painting of his studio that's actually like a genre painting. It's kind of like a story. All these things are going on. Now when he changed his style to depict the common person, he loosened up. And this is probably the most famous work by Courbet. Here we see the beginning of modern art. I want you to notice how the pants are kind of simplified a little bit, how we see a kind of a roughness to the texture, and it's easy to imagine that we could see the paint strokes. But you know what? We will never know, because this painting was destroyed by Germans in World War II. By the Nazis. And the reason that we have a record of it is because photography, of course, had already been around and someone took a picture. So this is the painting that is seen as kind of the doorway painting, the bridge painting that really led to Impressionism and modern art. So this completes this slide lecture on academic into Impressionism. Thanks for listening.